Thank you, Malik, for the introduction, and welcome, Elizabeth, to Yerevan.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. It really is.
Now, last December, Elizabeth and her producer partner and husband, Stephen Woolley, were given a special award by BAFTA, the British Academy of Film and Television, for their special contribution to British cinema. And I think looking back over the last 30 years at the films you produced together, you really kind of made an impression, not just on British cinema, but world cinema. To think that 30 years ago, The Crying Game, a film which still kind of feels pretty relevant today.
They showed a restored print. I don't know if anyone's seen The Crying Game. Did anyone see The Crying Game? Which was nominated for 6 Oscars, and it was a very low-budget film. That director Neil Jordan, he wrote and directed it, and Stephen had produced Neil's previous 3 or 4 films. And they just showed a restored print at the British Film Institute 2 years ago, the 25th anniversary. And it is incredible to see it now, because it was so radical to have made that film then. I won't spoil the story in case anyone does see it, but I was blown away by how it stands up and just how daring it was. And now when you make it, there are films on a similar subject matter that are made and discussed and celebrated. But when we were trying to raise the finance for that film, we had people who were absolutely outraged by the subject matter and thought it was morally repellent and abhorrent, and said the story twist should happen in the first 10 minutes of the movie. And so it was extraordinary that the film was made and released and was such a big success, and I think has entered the canon of great independent films.
I'm sure we'll be coming back to The Crying Game later in this conversation, but at the risk of sounding lazy, I want to ask, as I'm sure many people here are interested in breaking into film, how did you get into the film industry?
I wish there was one answer to how you get into the film industry. Mine was a very circuitous route. I don't know how far to go back, but actually I wanted to be a scientist, and I wanted to be a genetic engineer. So I studied all sciences at school later, from the age of 15 to 18, and I went to university to read biology and chemistry. And I'd had a year off before I went, and I was working, for whatever reason, I was a television presenter. Don't even ask why, but I presented shows on Saturday morning, and so was quite well paid for someone that age. I didn't go to drama school, I just happened to land this thing. And so I then traveled, and I lived in Paris, and I went to the cinema all the time. And I was born in New York and really brought up on movies. I mean, just everyone went to the movies all the time. And I just felt in that year that actually I had limited myself academically. And so I ended up studying English, and then I did a graduate degree with quite a well-known academic, Marxist-Lacanian academic called Jacqueline Rose, and did a lot of studying of representation in film and cinema theory, film theory. And then I just started, I went back to New York. By now I was living in England. I went back to New York, and I just happened to get a job as a proofreader for $6 an hour. And the other people were there were all students, mostly from Brown University in Rhode Island, and they had studied semiotics as well. And we started making short films together, and we started, right at the bottom of the ladder, working on whatever was filming in New York at the time. And there was a film being shot in an apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan by a guy called Bill Sherwood, and he had written the screenplay and was directing it, and he had funded it from friends in his community, and it was being made for $300,000. And it was Steve Buscemi's first movie. And it was called Parting Glances, and we would clock in, proofread for 4 hours, clock out, get the subway uptown, and go help out on this film set in Bill's apartment. And when the film was finished, that was the first film set I went on, and I was doing things like peeling carrots for the crew. And then when the film was edited, Bill was editing it in his apartment, and he asked me to come back and help him. And I'd never edited anything. I'd been syncing up rushes on films to earn money as well. Christine and I had a moviola in our apartment, and we would sync up rushes at night for whatever, $10 an hour. So Bill taught me how to edit. He had a moviola and a flatbed, and it was the first time I saw an Apple Macintosh computer. He taught me how to use that. This is like, I'm a dinosaur. And the film was an international success. It showed at the Edinburgh Film Festival, showed in London, showed all over the world, and Bill and I became great friends. And we were asked to come out to Hollywood to meet with people at Columbia. There was a lawyer called Tom, it's a long answer. There was a lawyer called Tom Rothman, who was the lawyer on the film, who went on to be head of Fox Studios, you may know. But then he was a junior lawyer in New York, age 27. So we were asked to come out to LA and pitch new projects. And sadly, Bill was the first friend who died of AIDS, one of the first, which was a tragedy. So he only ever made one film, but it again was an incredibly radical film, because it was the story, the camera tracks down a hallway of an apartment building, goes into the bedroom, there's two people in bed, one sits up and it's a guy, and the other one sits up and it's a guy. And now that doesn't seem anything, but this was in 1986, and it was just so radical, because it was just a story. It wasn't about persecution, or it was just the gay world that Bill knew of on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And it's a great film. It's a really great film, and I know he would have gone on to be one of our great independent filmmakers had he lived. But anyway, that's how I started.
So how did you make the jump into film production? Because some of your earliest credits are around about the early 1990s.
So I did a lot of stuff in New York, and then I went back to London. Just my mum was not very well, so I thought I should go back and help out at home. So I went back, and I thought, I need to get a job here. And there was one person I knew that worked in the music business. I didn't really know people who were working in film then. This, by now, I guess it's about 1988. And I managed to get an interview at Palace Pictures, and Palace was the leading independent production and distribution company at the time, and distributed films like Evil Dead. They did everything from Evil Dead to When Harry Met Sally, and it was run by Stephen Woolley and Nick Powell. And Nick went on to run the National Film School, and Stephen was producing with Neil. So I started working there, and which was fantastic. It was just an incredibly dynamic, creative space that was bursting with cineasts. And the people who were there, like Joanne Seller, who's Paul Thomas Anderson's producer, Paul Webster, who was head of Film 4, who became Joe Wright's producer. I mean, the list, Daniel Batzek, who's now head of Film 4, just the number of people who went through those doors, who had such a passion and love for cinema, didn't sleep. It was just all about movies and parties and stories. And so I was very lucky to have worked there, and that was where the first producing credit was on Terence Davis' film, The Neon Bible, with Jenna Rowlands, that was the first film I had that showed in Cannes in competition.
Now, Palace Pictures for me was of particular significance, because growing up in the 1980s, I used to scour the video shops looking for Palace videos, and that was my education. Werner Herzog films, Jean-Jacques Bennick's Diva, Eraserhead. You got everything from Palace Pictures. But what's interesting about Palace, and I think it connects with the business of film programming, is that the production company grew out of a cinema, didn't it? The Scala Cinema. How did that kind of the programming ethos of Stephen shape the production company of Palace, and subsequently the two companies you formed and worked together on?
Well, Stephen came to film as an obsessive film lover. He was brought up in London. His mother actually went into labor in the cinema aged 18 with him. She can't remember the film, but that's where she went into labor, on the Holloway Road in London. So his first job was working as an usher on Screen on the Green, which used to be the Rex Cinema. And almost in those days, mothers would sort of use the cinema at the weekend as a babysitting. You know, you could just send your kids there and they could just stay there for a double bill. Or so it was just like me as a kid in America, just obsessively watching films, and then worked as an usher. And then he set up the Scala Cinema in King's Cross. Well, first it was in Scala Street in the centre of London. But I don't know if any of you have heard of the Scala. It was just the most extraordinary, creative, wild, anarchic space that showed all-nighters on Friday and Saturday night and had the most extraordinary double bills and, you know, some films that you weren't supposed to screen, like Clockwork Orange, and Crazy Prince he got hold of, like, you know, Thundercrack, and it was wild. And out of that, in a back room, Palace Video was born. And I think probably, you know, the ethos was really, it wasn't about chasing money, it was about chasing the great films that you loved, and establishing relationships with those filmmakers, so you would have return business. You know, if you got the first, Coen Brothers movie, they would come back, or the Tarantino movie, they would come back, or when you showed Fitzcarraldo's A Great Wrath of God, you would get the next Fitzcarraldo film, or Jean-Jacques Benet's, and you took the rough with the smooth. You know, not every film works out well. Sometimes you had a hit, then you'd have a flop, but you'd hope that filmmaker would come back with the next movie and distribute it as well as you possibly could. And be very creative. I mean, in those days, Palace was the first company to fly post, which was, you know, you just pay art students to go out and stick posters up on the corrugated iron in front of buildings and on the streets, and that just hadn't been done. It was really about breaking all the rules and saying we can do this another way. And it, you know, like punk had happened, and it was sort of like the punk movement in cinema. And I think that ethos of it's about the filmmakers, it's about the films, and also about having a wide body of work, which is why I say from Evil Dead to When Harry Met Sally, is that we've never, as producers, tried to limit ourselves to any one kind of film. We've never been very good at romantic comedies. We've tried, but we're not that good at them, so we don't tend to make many of those, but we try and have a breadth of work and expression. And
in the second half of the 1980s, Palace engaged in a collaboration with Miramax Films, and the Crying Game, because Palace went bankrupt, and then Miramax profited quite considerably from the success of that film. In light of all the issues surrounding the legacy of Bob and Harvey Weinstein, can you separate the kind of the business model of Miramax, and what was it from all of these issues which have since come to light?
Well, I think that, you know, there was a terrible recession in England at the start of the 90s, and so in the time that The Crying Game was being made, Palace was really struggling. And there was a company, Polygram was looking at buying Working Title, which was also really struggling, and buying Palace. And they hired an accountancy firm to do due diligence, and that process went on for a year and a half. And in that time, the debts are racking up. You know, it's a high-risk business, film production and distribution, because you can have a couple of flops, you know, one production flop, a couple of distribution flops, and you're really hurting. And there were lots of smaller companies, the video sales company, some post-production houses, a recording studio. But then you can have a huge hit that turns it all around. And in that time, Polygram decided not to purchase the company. They purchased Working Title and put lots of money into it and didn't purchase Palace. And the great irony was there were 5 films that were on the site we had bought for distribution, which was Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, Howard's End, God, I have to remember the 3 others, so which all went on to become big hits. So, but the banks had stopped the credit line, and it was a bad time economically in the UK. And Miramax was also going down the tubes. And we were all sort of related, because Miramax released Palace's movies, Palace released Working Titles films, so it, you know, these were 3 big independent companies. So the company went under, and Miramax offered to buy The Crying Game for a fixed fee, and people who worked on it worked for a deferral, because we just couldn't raise the money to make the movie. So we asked everyone who was working on it to defer some of their salary. And if the film was sold, they would get paid their deferral. So Miramax made an offer and said, but we'll give you this, all the deferrals will be paid off, and you'll never see another penny. So that was the deal they did, to be fair, but they had the company over a chopping block in a way. And the film went on to be a phenomenal, phenomenal success. I think, you know, to unpack it aside from all of the, you know, the horrendous stories of sexual abuse and exploitation and bullying, and the company was bullying in its business approach, and that was the first example of really it was a bullying approach of we see how we can market this film and make a fortune, and they knew that. And you could argue that, you know, it was a strong business position that they took. But I think what was important to me to distinguish is that what Harvey was a maestro at marketing and distribution, and they were a distribution company, and it's represented in the press over and over that he was this wunderkind producer. Well, he wasn't a producer. There were several films they produced. Some worked, some really didn't, but really they were distributors. They took other people's movies, like The Crying Game, like The King's Speech, like Carol, and many, many others, and distributed those films. They did not produce those films. They bought them for the US, they paid in advance, or they bought them on completed movies. The King's Speech was a completed film. The Crying Game was a completed film. Carol was a script that was packaged. So they were distributors who then put their logo and company name and took executive producer credits. So that, I think, is the frustrating thing about the representation. And as distributors, they did a brilliant job. You know, they really worked those movies, and they chose very well the films they wanted to distribute. I mean, it's sort of unraveled towards the end, but people tend to become victims of their own success, and it's hard to stay ahead. But it was a pretty toxic place. You know, there was lots of bullying, lots of shouting, and pretty underhand tactics, which probably, you know, you see a film like Wall Street, it's certainly an approach that dominated many different disciplines and business operations at the time. Fortunately, nowhere that I ever worked, so.
Did that kind of experience inspire you to do things differently?
I don't think I needed that experience to inspire me. I think that you're drawn to like-minded people. I mean, you know, look, Harvey, Carol was not well distributed. I think by that point, the company was going down the tubes financially, and, you know, he was fighting lawsuits and not focusing on the film at all. The Crying Game, The King's Speech, many others that went on to get awards, you know, Shakespeare in Love, were brilliantly distributed. There is no question that they weren't brilliantly distributed. But I've always worked, and still do. I mean, you know, Christine Vachon and I started making short films 30 years ago. And we're working, you know, we've produced three films together with Christine and her partner Pam and Stephen. And I think you're drawn to people who have a similar approach to you. I would never want to be in an environment, you know, I've always worked for myself, other than on one or two odd occasions since I've been producing, but I just wouldn't want to create that kind of environment to work in. It's, yeah, not something I need to be inspired to do, otherwise I just think I'm not that type of a person.
This masterclass is taking place in the context of a co-production forum. What advice would you give in terms of establishing and finding a collaborator, a co-producer?
Well, obviously having similar tastes really helps, I think. But also traits that complement each other. I think that the partnerships that I've had with other producers, like with Stephen or Christine, is that I tend to be quite quick, like pushing through things, you know, making a list, ticking it off, moving on, covering things. Stephen's much more contemplative and takes much longer with decisions than I would do and looks at all angles. And actually, I think it's a partnership that works very, very well together. And we definitely, it's very rare that we don't agree on films that we see, which really helps, because then when we're looking at filmmakers we want to work with or stories that we want to develop, you're occupying the same space to have a creative discussion. I think the advice really is to, choose someone who has a similar work ethos to you and a work ethic to you, shares aesthetics and political taste, political outlook to you, and just to make it about the film. I think if you try and chase the money, I mean, there's so many examples of films that have gone on to be huge successes that were rejected at script stage, rejected as finished films. I'm sure there's two prophetic stories that I tell. You might have heard them, but I could tell them if you... Lives of Others. I don't know if anyone saw Lives of Others that won the Oscar. Well, that film, at first it was turned down at script stage over and over and over again. They really struggled to get the financing. And then when the film was completed, it was turned down by Cannes, Berlin, Venice. Didn't get into any festivals. Came out and, was a big hit and won the Oscar, and it's a fantastic film. And similarly, Slumdog Millionaire, while that film was being made, Warner's had an independent arm called Warner's Independent. So when Fox set up, first of all, when I first started working, it was an explosion of independent film. So in New York, you had, Sony Pictures Classics, you had Orion, before that you had, now I'm trying to remember all the independents. Loads of independent distributors and outfits, and the same in the UK when there was Working Title and there was Palace, and the studios were like, oh man, these independent films, they're not paid for that much money and they're doing really, really well. So Fox set up Fox Searchlight, and then the other studios followed with varying degrees of success. So Paramount had Paramount Vantage, New Line had Fine Line, Warner's had Warner's Independent. So while they were shooting Slumdog Millionaire, Warner's, they're suddenly like, oh God, it just clogs up the system. Why do we have this independent? We just want to make blockbuster movies, for 120 million, whatever, 40 million upwards. We don't want to be making these movies for $8 million. It takes so much time, so much effort, the return isn't big enough. So they closed Warner's Independent down. So when the film was finished editing, Christian Karlsen, the producer, and Danny Boyle flew over to show it to the head executives at Warner Brothers in LA. So they watched the movie, and they said, straight to DVD. Like, what are we going to do with this movie? It's got no stars, and it's 95% in Hindi, so straight to DVD. So Danny Boyle had a relationship with Peter Rice, who was executive at Fox Searchlight. And he said, look, please just give me 24 hours. Please give me 24 hours to see if I can set it up somewhere else. So they said, okay, because they felt badly. Danny Boyle had made this movie, and they came to LA to show it to them, and they're like, DVD. So they screened the film for Peter Rice and the team at Fox Searchlight. Peter Rice calls up Warner Brothers and it's like, it's a bit of a problem. I can see no stars, Hindi. I tell you what, we'll take it off your hands. I don't know what he paid for, but obviously Warner's were like, yes, thank God, we got this film off our hands. And then if you look at the footage at the Oscars that night when they picked up their 8th Oscar or whatever, how many did they win? 8 or 9, and $365 million worldwide. Those poor Warner's executives were looking sick. But it's just that, it happens, you just don't know. I was saying earlier, no one sets out to make a bad film. You all set out to make a good film. And there is no magic formula, which is, I think, what's so interesting now. It's always been a process, not always. Probably it started in the 80s with the rise of marketing. Everyone was into marketing. And you would, suddenly it was like, okay, we'll test screen the movie. then it was like, we'll test screen the movie and we'll test the poster. We'll test the trailer. Well, everyone was testing. And now it's just obsessive with the studios. So now there's sort of algorithms about storytelling, like, Netflix will have their algorithm. So there's always been an effort to try and make the business of storytelling, and I'll call it storytelling because now it exists in so many forms, to be reducible to an empirical structure, reduce it down to a science. And I don't think you can. I don't think that storytelling is reducible to a science. I mean, there's so many things that come into play with an audience's response. There's probably a film that does really well. You could release it 2 years later or 2 years before, and it might not perform at all. Similarly, films that don't do well, had they been released at another time. There's so many things that come in, and responses to storytelling are emotional responses. So it's fascinating at my age to watch the ever-increasing sophistication of trying to make it a science so that you know what will work and what doesn't work.
Now, you've, as a producer, you've made biographical films like Colette. You've made films about real-life events like Made in Dagenham. Genre films like Byzantium.
Yeah.
What do you look for in a story as a producer?
So people ask that, and again, I wish I could say without saying that it's a kind of visceral response to something, which typically it is a visceral response. I mean, obviously with a genre film, everyone's talking about elevated genre, which everyone's attracted to. I think for me, I didn't set out to be like, I'm going to be a feminist filmmaker, but I definitely have predominantly told stories with women at the center of those films. And I think that's, I don't think it's any surprise that when I was 6 or 5 and I went to the cinema to see National Velvet with Elizabeth Taylor and Mickey Rooney. And I don't know if you know the film. Elizabeth Taylor plays a young girl, Vi, who's riding her horse, Piebald. And she enters the National, and she dresses as a boy to win, and she falls off, and they find out she's a girl. And that film really spoke to me as a 6-year-old child, and I think that somewhere, obviously, my mind was like, so you can do these things. You can, as a woman, enter spaces where typically women have been marginalized or represented in a very particular way, and so I'm always drawn to those stories. And it's an amazing time now with the storytelling that's happening, where marginalized groups have come right to the center, and it's just incredibly exciting.
I think that's a good point to ask if anyone has any questions for Elizabeth. Maybe later. Any questions right now?
Don't be shy. Can you understand? Am I talking too quickly? It's okay? Good.
Thank you. I would like to ask, as you talked about formulas, I would like to ask if you are if you have some formula of choosing the audience of the film, how you are doing it and how you are putting it into your package.
Yeah,
of the feature film.
It's a really good question. I mean, the demographic of the kinds of films we make, which are considered to be high-end independent films, they call them high-end, is getting older. I mean, the demographic for independent films in general is getting older, and it's definitely a problem in the industry. And there's been many discussions about how you get a younger audience into the cinema. There's been discussions about, do we drop the price point? Is it just too expensive? I mean, in the center of London, to go to the cinema is what, £16 a picture house? 15, 16 pounds? What is that? It's 600 drams, isn't it, to the pound? So that's, is it? Yeah, I think. So 6,000, 7,000 something, 8,000 to get into the cinema. So it's expensive. But so almost by default, the films we make are for an older demographic. They tend to skew female and 40 plus. We definitely would like to make films for a younger audience, but we know that audience is there and it's a solid audience and they are going to the cinema. I mean, we don't make blockbusters, so event movies, blockbuster event movies, young kids will go to. But back in the day when the cinema was attended, you know, you would definitely say, okay, this film skews younger, this is what we think the demographic is. What you hope is something like The Crying Game, for example, it's a breakout movie, so you will aim for one demographic, and then you'll see it break out, and that's when you have a hit with an independent film, is when it breaks out. With something like Carol, you know, high-end drama, and it was targeted at female 40 plus, with the hope that, like a Brokeback Mountain, it would go outside of that demographic. With Carol, it didn't. But it's a film, I mean, it shows every Christmas in New York, and I think it's a film that will have a very, very long life and is constantly now turning up on, you know, the greatest films of the decade or the greatest film of da-da-da. So I feel very proud of that film, and over time it will reach a long audience. And some films that get to their audience quickly get forgotten and everyone's moved on. So it's not a direct answer, but yeah, you do try and figure out what your demographic is, but the demographic, the industry has shifted so much, and with Netflix, you know, now just announced they're building a studio at Shepperton, the business is just changing so fast, and no one really, there's a lot of negative stories about what will happen to independent cinema in the UK, that it will just disappear quite rapidly. And whether that doomsday scenario is correct or not, I'd like to hope not, but it's definitely a very tricky time.
Are there any other questions? Some more later. Jean Cocteau said that when film and cameras becomes as cheap as pencil and paper, we'll get poetry. We're at that stage. Do we have poetry? Can we have poetry?
So interesting you say this is not a direct response to that, but recently the professor I told you who taught me, Jacqueline Rose, had a birthday in London, and all the great, like Laura Mulvey, do you know Laura Mulvey? Peter Wallen, Laura Mulvey was great. She was there. She must now be 80 or something, sharp as a tack. And she was saying, just tell me what's happening in the business, what's going on with movies. And Stephen said, well, last time we saw you, Laura, you said that cinema was dead. And she said, no, I wouldn't have said that. And then he said, no, you did. And she said, well, maybe I did. And what she said, which I thought was so interesting, was that actual filmmaking, cinema on celluloid, you know, 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, is just a blip on the landscape, the timeline of art. So if you think about sculpture, painting, they're still here with us. But actual filming on celluloid was like, you know, barely 100 years, right, gone. And I think that's so fascinating to, you know, people still sew and people still create costumes out of clothing, and music is still created with, you know, actual instruments, and it's kind of a mind-blowing thing to think that that particular art form of light on emulsion and developing it was just a nanosecond in the timeline of human storytelling. But I don't know what, I mean, well, you know, we were talking about the Great Cinema, where you've got your installation this evening, and we were in Havana a couple of years ago, and we had a tour of these incredible Art Deco cinemas that seated 3,000 people, and we were looking and just imagining what it would have been like to watch Psycho in Havana with 3,000 people. I mean, it just, what an experience that was. And it, you know, progress is now that a lot of people will watch things, including me, you know, on a laptop. And but it's too reductive to say, it's terrible, or there's so many different arguments and so many different discussions about access and storytelling, and also I think, you know, I spent the whole plane ride watching Killing Eve, binging, and it's great. It's a great TV show, and it's a TV show that plays with, you know, breaks boundaries around race and gender and, you know, constructs that have been with us for years, and it just jumbles it all up, and it's brilliantly well done. But TV is definitely a writer's medium. It's about moving the story on, cliffhanger at the end of each episode. Film is very, very different. And what we've seen recently are, so this doesn't really answer your question, does it? Should I just keep going?
It's very, very interesting, so please do.
But we've had a few cases with filmmakers that we've met, I won't name names, but we're developing projects, and they would consider to be auteurist filmmakers. They've had films in Cannes, they write, they direct, and 3 of them are women, and they have been hired to do quite high-level TV series. And one of them has finished it and was really broken by the end of it and very damaged, and the other one is in the midst of post-production and really, really struggling. And the other one has just started filming and is finding it a bit tricky. And it's because, in a way, you're putting a square peg into a round hole. So for branding, the big corporations want to take the auteur director because it's great for the marketing. It's a woman, someone who's had films and festivals, has won awards, is hip, is cool. But then, of course, what they really want is just to deliver as a TV series, which is a totally different form of expression and a totally different medium in terms of its narrative and use of visual images. And I'm curious to see where that goes, and also where the huge move towards TV goes, because a friend of mine who is a scientist said the laws of physics are that movement creates a vacuum. And we will always tell stories. We're constructed to tell stories. Our life is a story, you know. So what happens in that space when everyone's doing this? Everyone's like, oh God, it's Netflix, it's Amazon. I'm not saying that's bad at all, but everyone's rushing there. What happens here, really?
Well, I have my own personal test as the difference between TV and cinema.
Tell.
And I basically close my eyes, and if I can follow the plot, that means that the images are not essential. And whereas a film like, I don't know, 2001: A Space Odyssey, I don't think that's ever going to get an Oscar for its dialogue. But you make films specifically for cinema. I mean, why do you make films specifically for cinema? I mean,
have you heard that line about old dog, new tricks? I mean, we're old. We've been around forever. That's what when we started, that was like the space of social and political and cultural rebellion. I mean, even, when I was 15, 16, I would go to the Paris Pullman off the King's Road in London, and you would just stay up watching movies all night. Soylent Green, Easy Rider, Fassbender movies, you name them. Was that to be like, you say to your parents, oh, I'm spending the night at Emma's house, and then you'd be up all night in the movie watching people like do radical things. It was incredible. It was just incredible. It's completely different now. It doesn't, I don't think it exists certainly not in the West. It doesn't exist in the same way. Interesting. And people, like the Weinstein brothers have said it again, they would go see these European art house movies because you could see naked women. That was like, there wasn't another way to see naked women on screen if you lived in Queens, New York, in a very religious family in, what is ostensibly very puritanical culture in America. So it doesn't exist in that way anymore. Yeah.
Do you think there's something about the communal aspect of cinema? I mean, particularly something like the cinema like the Scala, which the way everybody remembers those experiences, they're kind of like communal memories. How is that different now with the way people watch films now? Because a lot of the time people watch it independently and then talk about it.
Yeah, they do, but you see what happens is I think the communal thing you're saying absolutely is essential to society, is, you know, we gather in groups and we have shared experiences. It so happens that the act of viewing is increasingly happening one-to-one with whatever your device is. But secret cinema is huge. Anything around events. I mean, we've seen the resurgence of live music. And Stephen, he went to see his favorite football team, Tottenham Hotspurs. They were playing in the European Cup final, right? Where were they playing, in Madrid? I should remember. So he bought tickets to go see the match projected in the new Tottenham Hotspurs stadium in North London with 2 of our daughters. And the tickets were £10, and it's a brand new stadium that has this unbelievable acoustics. And he said the stadium was packed, and they had these huge screens projecting the game. And he said the atmosphere in the stadium was unbelievable, just unbelievable, because he said they did something with the sound, so the audience were somehow repeated back to themselves, and it created that thing of, like, you know, when Janet Leigh gets stabbed in the shower, it was that moment where 3,000 people are just like, oh. And he came back and he said, oh, I think I've seen the future of cinema, that there'll be somehow like these big event screenings, and I don't know, like, you see what's happening with secret cinema and the popularity of that. It will just be a different form.
Can you just briefly explain? I mean, does everyone know secret cinema? Okay. Just for the people who don't, could you just explain the concept?
I've never been to one. Have you been to one?
I've not been to one.
Okay, I haven't been to one. But if you're young, you can. So secret cinema is people, they keep it secret. You buy a ticket. I think it's like £65, right? 65? Is it £65? Something like that. A lot. Oh, they do, yeah. It started in the UK. And you go and you dress as the characters from the film. And narratives of the film are played out in this great space. It's almost like interactive theater, you know, like immersive theater. It's like immersive cinema. And then they screen the film at the end. So it's it's experience, you know. It's that whole thing about people want an experience. And so it's just evolving, really. It's just evolving how it gets told, and yeah. But I guess, as I was saying, because we've been doing this for 30 years, we've got a body of work sort of behind us, and we'll definitely carry on making films, yeah.
Are there any more questions?
I mean, you have a really an amazing biography as a producer, and later we talked a little bit about about Netflix. But I want to ask you, what are the challenges as a producer for you? Because the medium is changing very fast. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges as a producer you see?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges are many. Just raising the money now, because in the UK, there's very few independent distributors now. And for the level of film we make, you need to have a UK cornerstone theatric deal in place, a very decent size advance, and that's increasingly difficult. So funding is difficult. And then some of the high-end European distributors that we work with, typically France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, you would hope to do big pre-sales in those territories. And similarly, those independent distributors have really been struggling. So financing the movie gets more difficult. We would finish our films and then take them to a film festival, Cannes, Venice, Sundance, and then sell them to the US. It's harder to sell at a decent price in the US. Again, even the distributors there are struggling. And then on a practical level, because crews and cast can be paid so much money for doing a 6, 7, 8, 9 month job on a series, you know, England's a small place, and it attracts so many people because the tax credit is 20% for TV and film. It's a really stable economy. We'll see what happens with Brexit. We must be the craziest country in the world. Anyway, but at the moment, it's still, the economy is relatively stable, so the tax credit is stable. We have incredible crews. You know, the UK crews are renowned throughout the world. Great locations, building new studios. There's a new studio going up in Dagenham. Now Shepperton is being developed. So it attracts lots of people, but the pool of craftspeople and the crew is only so big. You know, it's not a huge country. So it's very difficult to actually find crew, A, that will work for the money an independent film can pay them, and B, that are even available. So I know part of me thinks that as artificial intelligence takes over, you'll either pay to watch stories or be paid to make stories. Like, that will be it. We'll just all be telling stories. It'll be back, you know. So they're like Working Title and Barbara Broccoli and David Heyman have built a new school in North London, which is for 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And it's a technical college to just train in all of the behind-the-scenes jobs. And I think we'll see a real move towards that because it's such a huge business that offers real employment opportunities. And that's quite interesting to see the social and economic change that can happen and is accessible for all peoples, hopefully.
Any more questions?
I have a lot of what's next for you?
So we've got 3 projects that are that are in the process of getting closer to production. One is a screenplay by Alice Birch, who did a film called Lady Macbeth. Don't know if anyone saw Lady Macbeth with Florence Pugh. It was Will Oldroyd's. It's a fantastic independent film that came out the year before last. So it's an adaptation of a novella called Mothering Sunday. And we're talking to a couple of directors about coming on board that. And then we have a sort of dystopian future project called The Assessor, which is written by Mr. and Mrs. Smith, their young husband and wife writing team. And Stephen came across that in a competition and said, "Oh, I think this is really good. What do you think?" And I read it, and we met them, and we said, "We want to make it." And so both of those are being developed with Film 4, and we have a young French director on that called Fleur Fortuné, who's done a lot of short films and music videos, really talented. And then we have a couple of other projects, one with the novelist Ishiguro, who wrote Remains of the Day. So about 3 or 4 things that we have scripts and directors on board, or about to have directors on board that will start casting, and then we'll start raising finance.
Do you think that all the major film studios like Warner Brothers, Lionsgate, Disney, they're going to make their own sort of Netflix subscription thing, and then?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, they have to, right? They just, I mean, I don't see that they really have a choice. And Netflix, I mean, the incredible thing about Netflix, someone who works there, has got a job, so they were so blown away when they went to work there, because actually the editorial department, the story department, was so small compared to the IT side of things, the software side, which is huge, because that's what it's all about. And it is amazing when you think, I don't know what happens in Armenia, but in the UK, when you buy your remote control for your TV, there's a red button that says Netflix. And you were like, "Oh, that's cool, there's a Netflix, that's amazing." You know, you buy it, and then you go, "Wait a sec, there is a Netflix button that you just push." That is, how did they do that? Like, how, when no one was seemingly looking, some genius was like, what we need is that you get home and that button, it's not black like the other buttons, it's not silver like the other buttons, it's bright red, and it says whatever, NFTLX on it, NTFLX. That's a phenomenal thing as a business to have achieved in a relatively short space of time. And what drives the company ambition is to make sure that anywhere in the world, whether you pick up your mobile phone, your iPad, your laptop, your TV in your living room, whatever that device is, and whether it's going to be a Google Glass, whatever it will be in the future, that red button will be there. And when you press it, it comes up, mine comes up and says, EK is watching. Do you want to finish this, or would you like that? I mean, it's phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. So the other companies are lagging far behind. But of course, the other thing that's going to happen, like sometimes I'll sit down and I'm like, so wait a sec, I pay for Now TV, I pay for Mubi, I pay Amazon Prime, I pay for Netflix, and you think, oh wait, so that's like whatever it is per month. And then when all these others get going, like people aren't going to be paying for 10 or 15 different providers. So then, and I think this is what's being discussed now, is then you have these firms, you know, amalgamations and deals, and then I don't know, you know, as ever, it's about cultural and economic hegemony and trying to make sure that your cultural expressions can exist within that very, very dominant structural form that has the red button, I think.
Any more questions? Just adding to that point, do you think we're moving towards a situation like the famous Henry Ford quote, you can have any colour you want as long as it's black? Is that where we're heading with things like Netflix?
Yeah, and then, but of course, then if anyone has seen Julian Temple's documentary, Detroit, I don't know if have you seen, it's amazing. So Julian Temple is a great documentary filmmaker, made a film about Detroit, which I encourage you to watch if you can. And it's kind of amazing watching that, where you thought, okay, we've asked you that question and we're the great car makers, and then it's that thing of like movement creates a vacuum, and you know, we all become blinded by our own success. And so of course many things happen, you know, we're always in a state of change, and you know, cinema is always going to exist in some form, and also generations behind us will always want to rebel or shift things up, and you know, when you look at Nadine Lebecki's film Capernaum, which is, I don't know if you've seen, it was an amazing film, and you know, it did okay. It had made 14 million worldwide, which wasn't bad at all, and it didn't work in the UK, but it's a difficult film. It's a brilliant piece of filmmaking. I absolutely loved it. There's a lot of pain, you know, social and political pain in it. But that film opened in China, and not that everything is all about box office, but it does help us with independent cinema. It made 41 million in China, and no one saw that coming. And I think it was a combination of the marketing of the film was absolutely brilliant. And also cheap. They used social media, and in a way, because independent cinema is new in China, so it's so much easier to be innovative. We all become, as I keep saying, victims of our own success. But you know, the thing about Palace when it started and said we're going to fly post, and we're going to get kids out of art school to design posters, and we're going to open films here, and the establishment were saying, no, you can't do that. You can't, because once you become establishment, it's hard to reinvent yourself. But the way that that film was marketed in China is they filmed grown men in the cinema crying. And that went on to social media. It was sort of like, look at this grown man who is just weeping, is in pieces emotionally, and it's because of this film, Capernaum. And that really, really took off as a marketing technique. And then it's, you know, it's a film about an impoverished child. I didn't know that Oliver is one of the great, you know, Dickens, they're obsessed with Dickens and all. So obviously that film did feed into a kind of cultural specificity. I didn't think it realized it was, and then the marketing took off on top of that. But you know, that's amazing that that film can work there. So then you think there's a whole other space for, you know, independent film in China, and when the quotas are relaxed. And
what about risk-taking? Because, I mean, my favorite Palace production is The Company of Wolves, and everything about that film, from the choice of the writer, Angela Carter, the structure of the film, and the way that it's kind of a story within a story within a story, to the fact that it was opened in the biggest cinema in London, and everybody told Stephen not to do it,
Yeah.
including David Putnam.
Yeah, he's got a letter from David Putnam saying you're out of your mind, you've got no idea what you're doing.
And it worked.
Yeah, yeah.
So how much faith do you place in gut instinct?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, that was, you know, they were young. I mean, Stephen and Neil were 25 years old. You know, you try me telling my 25-year-old what they should be doing with their life. And it was all about the storytelling and all about the filmmaking, and two people who were like, cine literate and, you know, wanting to break the status quo and wanting to break the establishment in all cultural forms and politics with a capital P. But yeah, you have to go on your gut instinct. But that's what's so fascinating about this move to reduce it to a science. So the industry, you have to take risks. It's an industry which is predicated upon risk. But of course, it's very difficult to take risks in an environment where people are running a bit scared, where the distributors are struggling. And these films aren't working, and they're not finding their audience, and they're not getting a younger audience in. And then you have more conventional films that get made because they're being made for older people, and you're kind of going, but yeah, those were the people who were at, you know, the Sex Pistols gig at the Screen on the Green. So why would you think they can't see something really cutting edge? And I think they can, but when you see on TV, like in some ways, the stuff that you see on TV occupies some of that space that independent cinema was occupying. And the films, some of the films that are working in the UK recently, you know, very good films, but probably more traditional in their story and subject matter and catering for an older audience. So risk-taking is essential, and the number of films that have broken out have been all about taking risks. You know, algorithms are not about risk-taking.
Are there any more questions?
I would like to know, you worked on one documentary film, if I'm not mistaken, about Eurovision, I think.
Yeah.
Why only one? Because you think that it's different profession to be a producer of documentary film, or it's maybe more risky?
Yeah. I was thinking about that, because we shot some of it in Tbilisi, which I hear is just 4 hours drive from here. Do you know, we're such a tiny company, so it's just me, Stephen, an assistant each, a part-time accountant. There's really just 5 of us. And it takes, we make about 1.5 films a year, and we try not to develop too much because we want to make it. So it's very easy for companies suddenly to have like 25 projects that they're developing. A small company like ours, you 25 films, that would take you 10 years, you know, to make all of those. So we only develop 6, 7, 8 things at any one time. So you have to sort of choose your strengths. I mean, I loved that film. It's called Sounds Like Teen Spirit, and it's a really wonderful little film. When the idea was pitched, I just loved the idea. I loved the filmmaker. We were able to raise the money. I was really proud of it. But it, you know, it took a lot of work. There was 200 hours of footage that we had to get down to 90 minutes, and is a lot of hands-on work. And I would love to make more documentaries, but I think Stephen and I made a decision that we didn't just want to be executives, you know, and have a big company and lots of people working for us. We wanted to actually be very first-hand relationship with the movies. So, you know, if we had worked differently and said, okay, we're gonna have a TV department and a documentary department and a film department, and we'll just sit in big offices here and direct everyone. But we just chose, not that it's better or worse, that's just how we chose to work. So, but I love documentaries. You know, there's been some incredible documentary films that have been made, and it's seeing directors like Asif Kapadia, who I first developed a project with out of film school, to see his success with Senna and Amy and Maradona it's phenomenal. I mean, he's just such an extraordinary documentary feature maker.
Any more questions? I have a question, just jumping back in the conversation slightly. You mentioned earlier in your career you studied film theory. What do you see as the relationship now as a working producer between the academic aspect of film and practical filmmaking? Has one side got anything to learn from the other, or vice versa?
Well, I think for me, when I look back and when I was, like studying Barthes and Lacan and Derrida and stuff, you're a kind of kid and it sort of makes sense, but it was kind of also trying to get your head around something. And actually what I find really exciting is, I think, in many ways, the stories that you see being told and how those stories are being told is actually exactly what those expressions were. I find it fascinating now that, mechanisms of control, government, whatever forms, trying to keep these binary things in place, like trying to say, you're a man and you behave like this, and you're a woman and you behave like that, and you are, have got black skin or brown skin and you've got white skin, and how it's just not possible for things just don't stay in those places. And so even when I was watching Killing Eve on the plane, you're like, it just doesn't, like, it's so exciting to see kind of what Lacan was talking about, of like when you've got the bathroom door that says this on one side and that on the other side, and this is how society is supposed to be structured. And of course you saw it being told out of the new wave of how stories were being told and how things were being filmed. And now it's sort of going into a different space about representation. But I do really see the work of those theoreticians. I mean, obviously for someone like Todd Haynes, completely informed by academic film theory courses that he did, and the stories that he's told, from Poison to Save to Far From Heaven and Carol. And you see these people who are practitioners being informed by their academic study in the way that, someone like Chris Marker, but I think now it's moved into more of a mainstream space, which I find really thrilling.
Going back to the Scala, a lot of the films and the culture it nurtured was the counterculture. But with people like, say, for example, John Waters, who were kind of punk figures back in the day, they're almost mainstream now. And when you actually look at, RuPaul's Drag Race has been like a huge popular success. Is there such a thing as the counterculture anymore? And well,
that is such a great question. Then that's why I was sort of talking about the demographic, is how films in the cinema can be quite traditional now. And I'm sure coming from us as well. And, what is the counterculture space? And this isn't really relating to film, but I read a book recently by an academic called Kill All Normies, a woman called Angela Nagel. And she writes about precisely that in terms of the populist movement. So I don't know if you guys know the website 4chan. Does anyone know 4chan? I didn't know anything about 4chan. Have you heard of it? Had no idea that 4chan gets like 6 million hits, whatever it is, a day, and it's basically the domain of the kind of particularly male, 16 to 30 populist. And she talks about how, almost like stuff that Trump does, meaning constantly slipping and never being able to get at the point of a fact. And all of these things that were sort of part of a postmodern movement and part of a counterculture movement. And that on 4chan, they create these memes and create short films and then go, oh, I was just joking, or this wasn't, you took that seriously, or this is ironic, or this is... And a lot of that space, like started Adorno onwards, it was used for the counterculture movement, for the revolutionary movement, seems to have been, some people would argue what she does, that as the left talks about identity politics, and identity politics takes center stage in a lot of cinema expressions and TV expressions, that there is a whole other movement in parts of the web that are co-opting forms of expression that were typically a part of the leftist cultural movement. I'm probably not expressing that very well, but it's a fascinating book to read about precisely that.
Are there any more questions? Are there any films which, looking back in your career, you're particularly fond of, which have any kind of significance? I know it's the kind of get out clause question, but I'm going to ask it. I'm going to use it now.
It's so, and it's not a cop out. It's hard to say because you pour your heart into all of them, and you obviously, I'm incredibly proud of Carol because it took a long time to make, and I think it's really a really fine film that will be here for many years to come, and also because it was a bringing together of a group of us who first started working together 30 years ago, and that's a really fantastic thing to grow with a creative team like that. But really the Crying Game Stephen takes credit for, Neon Bible, working with Jenna Rowlands, who I had grown up with her in Cassavetes films, and I just couldn't believe that I was producing a film with Jenna Rowlands in it. Again, working, I think really I've worked, when I think of some of the female talent that I've worked with, from Annette Bening and Jenna Rowlands and Keira Knightley and Rooney Mara and Cate Blanchett, and that makes me incredibly excited. But it's really the people that I've had the chance to work with, and just getting to come to things like this. I've never been to Armenia, and to come here, to see films here in this incredible cinema, to meet people here, to find out about this culture, and it's I'm so lucky and so blessed. So really the whole thing, I'm proud of.
So would you give any piece of advice to anybody who feels like venturing into the world of film production?
God, my brother said to me once, he's like, a lot of it is just about getting up in the morning. And I thought, oh, that's such a good piece of advice. It's really, persistence. And I think really bearing in mind that people don't know when people will shoot you down or say no. I mean, there's so many times where you just get no. And you just have to keep, if you believe in it, just keeping on that, knocking on that door. You want to have a partner to help you do that because, in this industry, the highs are high and the lows are low, and it makes them much easier if you've got someone to ride that crazy roller coaster with. And just persistence, and being collaborative, choosing the people that you work with and understanding that it absolutely is a collaborative form.
Very last chance to ask questions.
Thank you. Back to the subject about the audience, I would like to ask, do you think that to get the young audience, we need to get into their phones? Now, for now.
Well, we were talking about this because we're doing a new website for our company, and something I found out that I didn't know is that websites are designed for phones. We were looking at everything on the laptop, and the guy who we were working with who's building it was like, well, are you looking on your laptop? And we were like, yeah. No, you should look at it. Or my assistant who's, 24 and they're like, no, you need to look at it on your phone. So, yeah, I mean, look, the first thing I watched on my phone was Superbad. I love Superbad. I loved Booksmart. Did anyone see Booksmart? Olivia Wilde's. It's such a great film. It's so fun. Yeah, I think definitely, you're not gonna stop the advance of technology. People watch stuff on their phones. They just do. And it's just thinking about how you get people into cinemas. And I do think, like Mubi I don't know if you guys know the site Mubi platform. They have a different film that gets added to the platform every day. So they'll have 30 films. Every month they'll have 31, and then one film disappears as another one gets added. And you get incredible films, and they'll also have access, like Carlo Vivari, they'll have films from there, or from Cannes, and they'll have retrospective, it's a Fassbinder retrospective, or an Agnes Varda retrospective, or it's a Cate Blanchett season, or whatever. It's an amazing site. But they're building their first cinema in London now, and they also have this thing, Mubi Go, so depending on what kind of membership, you can also take your Mubi pass and go see a new release film in a cinema. And I think it will just, you just have to be open. You can't, it's like people, say, globalization is a bad thing, or it's like, that's the world we live in now. You're not going backwards, that's where we are. And it's just embracing it. And I think a lot of discussions around the environment, it's trying to move forward and embrace new forms of technology that can solve. I do have big faith in technology. And I think that if you can be open to things and look at different ways of encouraging cross-pollination between different platforms, like between cinemas, and offering different experience in cinemas. I mean, I went to, we live just outside the city of Bristol in the southwest of England. And Bristol is a, you know, it's big, it's like whatever, the third biggest city in the south. But there's a university there, 2 universities. They've got 2 art house cinemas, one of the oldest theatres in England, and it's a great city. And I went into a space called the Arnolfini, which is an art gallery, a cinema, performance space, a restaurant, and free Wi-Fi. And there must have been about 150 students in there who were all studying. And I just think it's about having spaces which are multifunctional. Because if you think, okay, you've got a captive audience here, because these kids would rather study together, the libraries are full, and anyway, you don't have to go to a library anymore. So if this performance, if this gallery space will offer free Wi-Fi and something else, then you can have, oh, I'll break off from my studies and go watch a film for an hour, and then I'll meet someone at the bar, and then I'll come back and revise, and I'll go see that performance. So it's just, I think, about being more fluid, perhaps, in what you're offering in that space. I mean, I'm not an exhibitor, so, but I think it will change, and it will evolve, and it will take someone, like when Stephen came along and set up the Scala or set up Palace. It's just about those people who are visionaries and, you know, have an absolute passion for cinema and thinking, let's try this way to see if this works.
Any more questions? Elizabeth Karlsen, thank you very much.
Did you have a question? You're supposed to be behind the camera.
Yeah.
He comes out.
Yeah, very short question, sorry. I'm interested just, does websites like Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes, this rating system, have any impact on films?
That's a very good question, and the answer is yes, 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 in capital letters, boldface, underlined. I mean, we only realized fully a couple of years ago when distributors were like, Rotten Tomatoes. You know, unless you have got if you've got over 80%, 85% on Rotten Tomatoes, things like the distributors will spend more money on the da-da-da-da-da-da. It's, yeah, Rotten Tomatoes, huge. Again, for better or for worse, that's what people will go to. But you know what, though, that stuff changes as well, because now you hear this narrative where they're realizing that a particular type of person will go on and, well, obviously you've got the critics and Rotten Tomatoes, but critics are curators in a way. Like, who are those people deciding what films they like or don't like and what their subjective reading is? And as you see, I mean, you see it happening everywhere. You see in mainstream politics and voting and young people stepping outside of those structures that they see are set up by, you know, various capitalist systems around, just stepping outside completely and saying these structures have determined absolutely how we live our lives. Even time is determined, the way time is spent. So you're questioning, well, who are these voices who are dictating that it gets a splat or it gets fresh or it gets whatever it gets? So for now, yes, but I think, again, that will change rapidly, and it will change so rapidly in ways that I'm not entirely aware of. Like, if I asked my 3 daughters who are 22, 25, and 27, they're always in some other space, finding out about information and accessing things in different ways, and which I find endlessly fascinating and try and absorb as much as I can. But at the moment, yeah.
Thank you.
Long answer, sorry.
Any more final questions? Yeah? Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating and stimulating talk.
Thank you. Really, it's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a beautiful city, and I'm so looking forward to my week at this festival. It's a real privilege and an honor, so thank you.
And go to the Temple of Cinema in Kino Rossio, the Ararat Cinema. You'll be in for a surprise. Thank you.
I'll be there for sure.